In 2002, he was awarded the World Outsourcing Achievement Award by PricewaterhouseCoopers and the Michael F. Corbett and Associates for his work showing governments how to use public-private partnerships in the private sector to save taxpayer money and improve efficiency of their agencies. He earned his master's and his PhD in economics from UC Irvine, and prior to joining Reason, he served 10 years in the Army on active duty and the reserves. Without further ado, Waco, please give Mr. Adrian Moore a warm welcome, and thank you for your service to the country, sir.
Yeah, I live in Kern County, so I've heard about this fracking stuff now and then. It's interesting, like when you talk to like the crusty old oil guys who, as Chris made the point, there's many variations of fracking, and some of them have been done forever. And so some of these guys are like, what is all this about? You know, and you have to sort of distinguish, well, we're doing a lot more of it, as his numbers showed, and we're doing it in a lot of new ways, so it's not really the same old stuff that hasn't ever done any harm. So it does pay to look at it, but it's interesting to see the culture clash when you're in oil country like that. But I want to talk about P3s. I find P3s very interesting because, you know, it's a tool, it's out there, it's in practice all over the place. And there's always very interesting conversations about whether or not it's a good tool. I tend to think that's like, I don't find that as interesting as the questions of how do you know when it's a good tool and how do you use it right? You know, every tool is the wrong tool if you use it for the wrong thing. You know, using a hammer to try to put on a nut doesn't work very well, but it's great for putting in nails. So I want to emphasize a little bit. Let's see if I got this right. Good. So I'm mostly going to emphasize sort of what I've learned over the last decade and a half about you know, what it is that makes these things, or somewhat about how you know when they might be a useful tool and what makes them sort of work or not work in various cases. So the first thing is P3s is a pretty broad term. People are always trying to hammer out very precise definitions for different terms in this space, and it really doesn't stick. So you just have to live with the fact that there's lots of different ways of describing these things. But if you think about public-private partnerships broadly, there's everything from sort of relatively low-level contracting out of operational functions, ranging up to contracting out sort of facility-wide or system-wide operations, all the way through you know, having a P3 that finances, designs, builds, operates, and runs the whole gamut, and essentially everything in between. And the idea is that those are different tools designed to solve different problems. So the level of the P3 ought to be matched to the kinds of problems or the kinds of challenges or the opportunities that you're trying to take advantage of with the partnership. The motives obviously differ quite different. If you look at, and I'm going to really confine my remarks to water P3s since that's what's relevant to you guys. Different parts of the country, different places in time, and just plain different situations manifest in different reasons for why a community might be looking at a P3. You know, there can be compliance issues that tends to be closely wrapped into cost issues. So you've got a compliance problem, you don't have the money to solve the compliance problem, you're looking for some way to leverage resources, some new way to fund some changes. So the regulatory issues and fiscal pressures go hand in hand. I will say that's a much more common in older America. So you go to the Northeast, it's much more common. They have much older infrastructure. They have much harder time rebuilding their systems to meet compliance standards than we do out west. But you do see there where growth, just trying to keep up with demands on the system in fast-growing communities, replacing the infrastructure that has just run out its time on this planet, basically. Not just regular maintenance, but actual replacement that has to be done when the life cycle of that original infrastructure is wearing out. And then, you know, finance. So I should actually add to this list. You know, politics is these things are never devoid of politics, and politics can actually be driving the train. I mean, I've seen places where it is P3s are looked at in a larger context of other hard choices that a community has to make, which can be a healthy thing. And I've also seen it done when it's just driven by sort of an ideological, not driven by any particular needs, but just because political leadership wants to do it. That generally doesn't work out so well. Goals. The goals are tied to the problems, right? So you kind of see the matchup. Saving money, most common goal that I've seen around the country, but not dominant. Sometimes it is reducing costs. Sometimes it is containing the escalation of costs. So you've got a compliance issue. You've got a new project. Water rates are going to have to go up. The question is, through a P3, can you contain the increase in those rates? So it doesn't look like a cost reduction, but it's a reduction in the growth of costs. But also dealing with new technologies, dealing with growth, things, service innovations or risk management that where there's just not, it's the internal systems or the rules that have been established for a water agency simply don't allow them the flexibility they need, and this is a way of sort of breaking out of the box and allowing them to accomplish something they otherwise can't accomplish. And all of that sort of manifests down into, sort of put this in terms of guarantees, because I think that ought to be built into any P3, that if you're not going into a P3 saying, okay, we have some challenges we need to meet, we've got some goals we want to accomplish, those things need to be hardwired into the P3. So if it's cost savings we're after, then by gosh, they think that the deal has to guarantee to us some cost savings, or else we don't sign the deal. If it's putting in new technology, if it's complying with EPA standards, so you've got cases, a lot of cases in the Midwest where the P3 was driven by compliance issues, and the contracts were written to say, you get paid whenever we get a green light from EPA, and whenever we don't get any green light from EPA, you don't get paid. And it's the contract completely designed around their goal, which is to never get a bad compliance report from EPA again. And so different rules in different states, different incentives in different states, but blocking those things in, I think, is crucial. If it's a risk issue, then the risks need to be assigned to the private partner. That should be assigned to the private partner, and I'm going to talk more about that. And that should be hardwired into the agreement. I talked a little bit about the different types. It's just giving you the idea that there is a range. By far the most common form of public-private partnership in the water sector in the United States is short-term contracts with companies to come in and operate an existing system. 3 to 5 year O&M contracts, overwhelmingly the most common. But in the last 15 years, there has been a lot more longer-term and more comprehensive partnerships that involve design, build, finance, and other elements as well, especially for putting these things together to deal with growth. So expanding the existing plant or expanding the existing distribution system through some kind of design-build partnership, but also wrapping up then a contract to operate that system for so many years. Now this is data on for about a decade on what has happened with these things. So these, somewhere around the mid-1980s, we got to the point in America where more than 500 communities had done some form of water public-private partnership. And so we started having decent databases, and it built up over time. And so this is data that looks at various types of P3s out there. That term was coming to an end in that particular year. And what happened? Did the city or state or local government of whatever the public entity was decide to extend that partnership, which is pretty much all contracts have an option to sign up for another 3 years or whatever, or extend it for 1 year is more common, and just extend it annually? Did they decide to bring it back in-house and reconstitute a public operation, or did they decide to give it to another private company in a renewed competition? And what you can see from this data is that about 93% of the time on average over that decade, they decided to keep it either with the existing company or with another private company, and about 7% of the time they decided to bring it back in-house, though that itself breaks down into some complications, because you have some places actually recreated their public authority to operate the system, and some places it was sort of an intergovernmental contract deal. So they brought it out of the private sector and made an arrangement with a neighboring community or a larger, say a city contracts with the county or something like that, and that's who took over the operations. But the upshot is that I think this shows two things. It shows, A, that these things generally keep the customers happy. 93% renewal rate means 93% of the time the community is satisfied with what they're getting from the P3. So P3s are generally pretty successful. But it also shows, because every single year, somewhere around 5 to 8 communities in this country end their partnership and reconstitute some form of public operations. So if you ever hear anybody say, well, one reason you shouldn't go with a public-private partnership is you can never reverse it, BS. Towns are doing it as we speak in America, and they do it every year. It's not that hard. Partnerships are a tool. It's a tool you can quit using when you want to. Concerns, issues, there's plenty of them, because if 7% of them are going bad, then it's obviously not a guaranteed success. So these things do have issues. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these. So loss of control issue is elected boards often feel, and this is really sort of kind of a city level story. So city councils often feel like they have more control over city staff than they would have over some private entity with whom they have a 3 to 5 year O&M contract. And that is kind of a matter of opinion, because I've interviewed a lot of city managers and a lot of city council members who feel the other way once they've got a contract. They feel like they have a lot more leverage over through the terms of the contract than they did through the sort of labor negotiations process that they had going before. So it sort of depends upon your management style and I think your history. But again, that 93% renewal rate tells me that most of the time people feel like they're able to get what they want out of the deal. Risk transfer is probably the hairiest issue with these things, because the idea of any public-private partnership is to say, okay, well, the private sector needs to be responsible for certain obligations, and they need to bear the risk of failing to meet those obligations, and therefore have the incentive to make sure they meet those obligations, right? The contract has to be structured that way. If you don't structure it that way, if they get paid no matter what they do, well, they're not going to do a very good job. It's just like if you hire a plumber and you pay him up front, he may never come back and do the repairs, right? He's already got his money. What incentive does he have to actually do the work? So you have to structure these things so that the risk is actually assigned appropriately. And the flip side of that too is you can't give the private sector risks that they can't control. You can't have their money sort of depend on the whims of elections or things like that. Things that the public sector is much more risks that the public sector is much more able to bear. So the way that sort of breaks down into, see, I should have had, what were those 2 buttons for the pointer? Anyway, but this is an aggregation. So it looks at so you know which one. So it was control something.
Just control and then just.
Oh, okay. Oh, it's the mouse. That's the ticket. Okay. Yeah, there we go. I know. Yeah, that's right. Okay, so this is an aggregation. So this study looked at a whole set of P3s that had been in existence for a period of years, and so we had pretty good data on the cost allocations that occurred in those projects. And so what you've got here basically is this column here shows how the sort of scale of the cost for each of these elements of the project under the previous, the public sector management and operations. And the right hand shows how it broke down under the P3. So you can see, some costs are higher. Where'd it go? There we go. So, so your procurement costs are definitely go up with a P3 relative to doing things in-house, but your design costs go down, construction costs go down, financing costs go up, but the amount of total project risk that remains with the public agency goes down pretty dramatically. So you get a little bit of reduction in O&M costs, usually because of scale. The larger private operators have economy of scale advantages over most community operations. So you can see, if you look at the sizes, the biggest difference is in that risk, and that is you are putting a pretty sizable chunk of the variables of the project on the public sector, on the private sector operator, so that they have the incentive to keep those things contained. And if they're not good at it, they eat those costs. That's their job. They get the benefits when they're right, and they make the profits. They pay the price when they're wrong and lose money. That's what makes the capitalist world go round, and that's what creates that value for money delta at the top. That's ultimately sort of the cost savings that accrue to the public sector. And this is just looking at that bundle of actual P3s. Generally speaking, these are the risks how those risks were allocated. Not 100%. There were exceptions to this, but this sort of break it down. So you can see, the private sector takes over a whole bunch of construction, operation, and reliability risks. The public sector really, influent quality, and some shared things, changes, materials, and flood risks, things like that, tend to be retained by the public sector. All right. This is, never a popular idea with existing public workers. The most fascinating thing about this, there's a lot to be said. None of it probably surprising to anybody, except that the two things I've learned by working with a university that does a lot of labor market research on this stuff is that basically, if you are the more highly skilled you are within the operation, the more likely you are to actually see ultimately your pay and benefits go up. The more unskilled you are, the more likely you are to see your pay and benefits go down. So the government tends to overpay unskilled workers and underpay skilled workers, and that comes out in the wash with a P3 a lot of times. And the other thing is that when you go back and survey former public workers who are rehired by the private sector after a P3, what you see is a pretty steady increase in happiness with that over time, mostly driven by one thing, and that is upward mobility. Within a city water operation, there's like one boss, and that's as high as you can go, and only if you're not the boss, your chances of being that guy not that hot. If you're in one of these private companies that's running these water systems all over the West, your upward mobility is vastly higher than it is within a city operation, and that tends to drive a lot of the ex-post satisfaction. Containing costs, this is an issue that gets muddled because often these P3s are done when the system has to be expanded or the system has to be improved, and therefore water rates are going up. And so what you have is an increase in water rates happening at the same time as you have, or basically in concert with a P3, and the P3 is largely motivated by the desire to reduce the amount by which those rates need to be increased. I've seen that story play out over and over again. Anybody here who followed the Rialto P3 that's fairly recent, that was very much the dynamic that happened there. It's very typical of these things. And so what happens is, because people say, well, the water rates are going up because of the P3, so P3s raise costs and it's a bad thing. And they don't decompose the two issues. They don't actually look at the financials, and so they, these things get confused. You even see sort of reports that come out and just document all the times there were P3s and then there were rate increases. See, P3s are bad. They're just gouging by the private sector. Never mind, the rates are always controlled by the public sector. There's never been a P3 in the U.S. where the private sector was given control over rates. Just can't happen. And if you look at this bottom bullet, this is sort of some empirical work looking at a whole bunch of P3s in the 90s, and what you saw was that cost containment, that cost increase in containment actually play out in the data. Let me move quickly here. So, we all know water is a human right, and therefore you can't have the private sector involved in water. Just like food is clearly a human right, we can't have the private sector involved in food. Mobility is mobility is a right, so we can't have the private sector involved in anything to do with transportation. Certainly, medicine is a human right, so we can't have the private sector involved in anything to do with health care. Wait a minute. None of that makes sense, including for water. So, this weird, very weird subculture debate about human rights and water and how, therefore, you can't have the private sector involved has never made an ounce of sense. I don't even know what to say except for bah. Though there can be books written about it. So there are some pitfalls, and I'm just going to hit these really quick. So you've got to make sure, every time, no, that's not correct. Too often when I've seen a P3 go south, it has been because the customer did not check out the company they were hiring. Basically, companies that are not competent, it's not that hard to find out they're not competent. It's easy enough to call the city manager at every place where they've been before and get a pretty good sense of how happy their customers have been. And if you don't even do that, if you can't make 5 phone calls to find out how happy that company's previous customers have been, you don't really care about the quality of service. So do that work, check these people out. Reputation matters, and it's out there, and it's not that hard to check up on, and that is by far the best way to prevent that sort of problem. There's, also have terms in the contract that protect you from those risks. This is a partnership. There's a reason why that partnership word is in there. If it's an adversarial arrangement, if it's contentious and political, it's far more likely to go south than if it's how do we work together to solve a problem that we all share. Much more constructive approach, and I think communities that have been able to get into that mode have much more successful partnerships. Allocating within the contract the goals of both parties is crucial, and I really talked about that earlier when I talked about sort of accomplishing the public sector's goals. And this is a killer. This can be a very one-sided thing. When you sit down to negotiate a P3, you are probably sitting down with a company that has done this hundreds of times, and you have done this exactly 0 times, right? So it's a very lopsided negotiation process in a lot of ways. So most places, you don't see these P3s go through without the public sector hires a consultant that helps on their side, someone who has a lot of knowledge and has also negotiated under these things on the public sector side. That's one way you balance those scales. And the other way is you do some homework. Again, just like calling up those 5 city managers. I'm also a big advocate of, and I'm just using city managers as a example. It's whatever unit of government we're talking about. But again, learn from your peers. There are people up and down this state of California who have done P3s and have been doing P3s for years, if not decades. Why not call them up and have them spend half an hour on the phone walking you through, here's what you should watch for, here's things you want to look for, here's what I know about the different companies, da-da-da-da. That peer-to-peer information exchange is invaluable, and it's out there. And it's amazing to me how many times I've sat down with a city manager who's about to negotiate a P3, and he's like, oh, I never thought about doing that. Come on, dude. Why reinvent the wheel? Really? Do you want to do this all on your own? Don't do that. Don't do that. And then, you know, some things, a lot of this is derivative of a lot of reports we've done that have been sort of best practice reports. One of the things that I've spent a lot of time in my career working on this stuff doing is trying to be somewhat in that equalizer position to say, well, okay, I can introduce you to a few city managers who've been down this road, or city council members, or whatever it is. Yeah, I'll arrange the phone call. And putting together sort of guides that distill interviews with these people to sort of get that information into the hands of public sector folks who are thinking about doing P3s so they don't have to reinvent the wheel. And there's a lot of common elements, a lot of things you see repeated over and over again. So there's always a certain amount of adaptation. Every water system's a little different, every circumstance a little different. You gotta have to negotiate some things on your own, but you can grab a huge chunk of what you've got to do out of best practices and out of other people's experience and avoid having to reinvent that wheel. And that's really what this is all about. And I think that is it. That is it. Thank you very much.